Chapter 2. On February 18, 1967, I found myself on a Continental Airlines jet traveling at 500 miles per hour, heading for a refueling stop in Hawaii. Once refueled, I was heading to the Orient and the Naha Airport on the island of Okinawa off the coast of Japan. My orders were vague, but the insinuation was apparent. I was going to Vietnam. My suspicion was that Okinawa was another refueling spot along the way. There were others like me on this flight, 18-year-olds fresh out of high school. Our hair was cut short and tight up against the scalp, as it had been since our first day of boot camp. There were 25 names imprinted on my orders. I smiled and felt less alone when I recognized one of the names on the list, Dan Varner, a guy I had met in California during basic infantry training. Dan stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and was so big he looked like he could take on 3 guys at a time. He was soft-spoken, though, easygoing like me. Once, during basic, Dan and I took a weekend leave together in San Diego. We were walking down the street toward the business district, minding our own business, when 3 Navy guys began to taunt us from the other side of the street. We didn't do anything at first, but the humiliation became too much. With 3 against 2, the odds were on their side, but we were up for the challenge. We had to prove ourselves, so we ran across the street and became confident and aggressive in our talk and demeanor. Neither Dan nor I would have even thought of doing this before joining the Marines. I remember thinking just before the imminent fight, I hope we can pull this off. Sure enough, we did. They ended up running away before anyone could throw a punch, just proving that courage and belief in oneself can accomplish anything. We arrived at the airport in Okinawa and exited the plane. There, on the other side of the world, it was a pleasant 76 degrees, and I thought the weather wasn't so bad. I was expecting it to be a lot hotter, similar to what I had heard about Vietnam's heat. We all filed off the plane to an open-air staging area where the service personnel directed us to our duty stations. I walked up to a lance corporal who was sifting through several files of expected Marines. He directed all 26 of us to a military-looking bus to be transported to Camp Schwab for jungle training. I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment, Charlie Company's 2nd Platoon. All of us were to be in the same battalion, but in different companies and platoons. As soon as we had all boarded and sat down, the Marine driver slammed the door shut and stepped on the gas. My head jerked back from the acceleration. He wanted to beat the oncoming traffic at the exit of the airport, so he ignored the stop sign and drove recklessly onto the highway. The bus nearly tipped over. We all felt like we were going to die for sure. A thought passed through my head. I could see my father receiving a telegram. "We are sorry to inform you that your son died, not on some battlefield in Vietnam, but on a random bus ride on the island of Okinawa." The driver peered into the rearview mirror and laughed as if he were doing it on purpose, as some kind of initiation to Okinawa. He continued down the paved, winding road through a beautiful rural area, still smiling and driving like he was on the Iliana Motor Speedway in Schererville, Indiana. Those of us in the back of the bus bounced in our seats like we were bronco busting in Denver, Colorado. I wanted to check out the scenery, so I just settled in and accepted that I was in for one hell of a ride to the base. There were many typical Okinawan homes along the way. They were mostly square structures with small but beautifully crafted wooden porches that stretched around the entire home. Red clay shingle roofs extended over their porches and accented the local style. There were many variations. Some were simplistic and naturally beautiful. Others were unpainted, unkempt, and dilapidated. Around each home, old stone walls still stood as ancient perimeter guards from another culture and era. After about half an hour, we passed through an area of straw huts, which I suspected belonged to the farmers of the region, who led a simpler lifestyle. We were away from the city now and passing fertile rice fields. About 30 minutes later, we saw a scenic view of the ocean, mountains covered with dense jungle, and many beautiful valleys. The Okinawan drivers were just as crazy as the bus driver. Small cars and motorcycles zipped past us doing 50 miles per hour around 2-lane curves. They passed on curves and jumped brazenly in and out of the lanes, just missing oncoming traffic. Unlike back home, There were no posted speed limit signs anywhere, nor guardrails to keep vehicles from tumbling fatally down the hillsides. We passed many villages, but one in particular stood out from all the others. The driver had slowed down to peer at the local beauties. There were several very young Asian ladies walking on the side of the road. They wore the typical conical hats known as Asian rice hats. The white silk full-length dresses they wore fit so tight against their slim figures that any man would be moved to look. All the Marines ran to one side of the bus. We were a bunch of teenaged boys full of testosterone and vivid memories of the girlfriends we left behind. Of course we had to look. "What the hell, guys? Haven't you ever seen a woman before?" the bus driver yelled. "Sit down." We reached Camp Schwab at the end of the paved road. We were all instructed to get off the bus and file into a large 2-story brick building. Next on the agenda, hurry up and wait. So, for the next hour, I waited and wondered what was next for us in Okinawa. Another bus pulled in with more troops right behind us. As my turn in line got shorter, the Marines in front of me peeled off and went to their respective units. Finally, it was my turn. The clerk told me I was in BLT 26, short for Battalion Landing Team 26, for assignment to Special Landing Force Alpha. The clerk said my barracks was on the right side of the road and I was to report to building number 3. He stamped my papers 3 times so hard that a few of the items on his desk moved. I took my papers and proceeded to building 3. There were many long and narrow 1-story buildings in a row. All of them were on the right side of the road and up a slight hill. I found building number 3 and walked up the few stairs to the entranceway. Upon entering the barracks, I expected to have a positive feeling seeing my new unit for the first time. But not everything was as expected. The old Salt Marines of my new platoon had just arrived from Vietnam. They'd been stationed in Khe Sanh, a base near the Laotian border. This base was last in a long line of bases that ran along the DMZ from the ocean to our farthest outpost in the west. All the bases were valuable because they were the high ground overlooking the DMZ and the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. Charlie Company had run patrols toward the Laotian border and around the surrounding area, but met little contact. One of the problems with Khe Sanh was the huge rats that foraged in large numbers at the dump. The Marines told us the rats would leave the dump at night and run over their bodies while they slept. The rats were looking for scraps and empty sea ration cans the Marines had discarded. Many of the old Salt Marines also talked about a bear they killed while on patrol one day. They talked at length about how big it was. Some said it was 6 feet tall, while others said it was 9. It basically depended on who was telling the story. Lieutenant Francis, who was in charge of a reconnaissance patrol, was walking along a creek bed in a ravine. PFC Donald Smith was in the center of the squad and was shocked when he saw a huge black bear running down the hill toward the squad. The animal got within a few yards and reared up with his arms and claws outstretched. Smith saw the huge white teeth as the bear growled, dripping saliva from its huge mouth. It took another few steps toward the men, and that is when the entire column opened fire at the beast. It appeared as if nothing was going to stop him. PFC McCarthy pointed his M14 at the bear and pulled the trigger, and all he heard was a click. His rifle misfired, and he thought his number was up. PFC Robert Manning fired full automatic into its chest. Round after round hit the bear, but nothing seemed to be able to stop it. Pilgreen was a few feet away and was in the process of climbing over a fallen tree in the stream. He tried to take a shot from behind the tree, but Hart jumped up in front of him and opened fire on the bear. The bear finally fell with a thud. Pilgreen yelled to Hart, "Hey man, I almost killed you." Hart wasn't concerned. The bear fell just a few feet from the squad, and he wanted to see the incredible beast. The entire squad was totally out of order, and Ski, the radio man, told Francis that the commanding officer wanted to know what all the firing was about. Were they under fire, and if so, did they get any KIAs, short for killed in action? "Yes, sir," Francis told him. "We got 1 KIA. We bagged a black bear." The guys surrounded the dead bear to get souvenirs. One guy went for a tooth to hang around his neck, while another worked at a claw. The only one who had success was Flick. He cut off the bear's hairy ear, which came off pretty easily with his razor-sharp K-bar knife. The ear eventually became fetid and stunk for weeks until they thankfully disposed of it. Lieutenant Francis had to restore order, and everyone hated him for it. He yelled for everyone to get back on the trail. These were just some of the stories they bragged about. Of course, Lieutenant Francis was right to get order, but the men felt that Vietnam was miserable enough without someone always ragging on their ass. Not a single old salt welcomed any of us into the unit. The grunts seemed indifferent to the extra new men. You might say that I felt more like a nuisance than a brother Marine. As far as they were concerned, we were the FNGs, fucking new guys, and we would have to prove ourselves to them. While the old salts ignored our existence, the new guys stuck together, each assimilating into his own respective clique. Our training started the following day, which was a Monday. Staff Sergeant Malloy, the platoon sergeant, came into the squad bay with his 3 squad leaders. First squad was assigned to Sergeant Pike. Pike was about 6 feet 2 inches tall and very lanky. He had blonde, almost white hair that was cut tight on the sides, but a little longer on the top. He was from Danville, Kentucky. The leader of my squad, second squad, was Sergeant Jones. Jones was from Nashville, Tennessee, and stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had the body of a weightlifter, but it wasn't overdone. Rather, it gave him the wide shoulders look. Jones wore a buzz cut, making him almost bald. The buzz cut also gave him the appearance of an extreme Marine. He had the look of authority, of being a lifer and a leader. Whatever he said or did, I was certainly not going to be the one to question it. Corporal Muller was in charge of third squad. Muller's look was that of an average, older-looking Marine. He was 20 or maybe closer to 21. This was old for our platoon. Most of the guys in the platoon were just over 19. Our platoon sergeant, John Malloy, was actually a staff sergeant and not a big guy at all. He was maybe 5 feet 8 inches tall and an older man who I would later learn had a lot of common sense. He was all Marine and a lifer who hailed from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. All the squad leaders in the old salts looked up to the old Sarge because he was totally concerned about their welfare. I noticed they spoke of him with respect, and I could tell they all trusted that he was smart enough to get them through Nam. This wasn't Malloy's first go-around either. It was his second tour in Nam, and he didn't take any shit from anyone, especially some boot lieutenant. Malloy knew exactly what to do, and even his superior, Lieutenant Francis, knew it. Francis was the new platoon commander. He was a butter bar, a second lieutenant. A butter bar was the lowest rank of officer. Yes, Francis was trying to make his mark on the world and was totally gung-ho. He wanted to make a name for himself and couldn't be bothered with anything else. He was tall and thin with a tight flat-top haircut. He didn't have an ounce of fat on his body. He had obviously been working out a lot. His pants had creases in them, and his blouse didn't have a single wrinkle on it. We called that squared away. Francis talked in short, curt commands, but as soon as Malloy walked into a room, Francis was silenced by the cool command presence that Malloy carried. Malloy talked as if Francis wasn't even in the room. Sure, Malloy was outranked, but he was way too valuable for Francis to reprimand. The butter bar would have to take second fiddle for now. You could tell he didn't like it. "Today," Malloy said, "we're starting our training for the SLF. We'll be out in the field on compass marches for the next 5 days. You will be making forced marches in the night and in the jungle. We'll cross many rivers and devise routes through the steep ravines. This platoon will go to the rifle range for target practice and to set the sights on your weapons. You will be tested at recognizing booby traps and mines. Then we will go through camouflage training and learn to cross various types of rope bridges. Mike boat, landing craft, and Amtrak assault training will be toward the end of your training. At the very end of the training, you'll have to get used to helicopters, because that will be our primary mode of transportation in and out of Nam from now on." And that's exactly what we did, day after day, until the weekend. On weekends, we had liberty unless someone messed up and had to stay on base for KP, or kitchen police duty, peeling potatoes for the entire day. Kenville, or village, was not far outside our base and the easiest place for Marines to spend their money. The locals made their living on the Marines. There were lots of bars and small businesses on the main street in the town. Several of these businesses thrived as houses of ill repute, where a lot of Marines lost their virginity, if they had any to lose. We didn't have to be 21 to drink like we did back in the States. In Kenville, we just had to be old enough to put money on the bar. Then Monday came, and we started the training all over again. For 6 weeks straight, we trained in the NTA, or Northern Training Area, at the Counter-Guerrilla Warfare School. We attended demolition and landmine training. In Booby Trap School, we studied how the enemy would use low-tech devices to injure or maim Marines. The VC would sharpen pieces of bamboo into spears and place them into a hole on a path facing upwards. We called them punji pits. Lieutenant Francis kept challenging Malloy for control of the platoon. Some of the other officers in the company thought Francis was on the stuck-up side. I was sweeping our barracks and was shocked when I overheard Malloy saying to one of the squad leaders that Francis was the kind of officer who would get people killed trying to get the Medal of Honor and still use it as an opportunity for higher rank and advancement in the Corps. After 6 brutal weeks of jungle training, we started the second phase of training, helicopter and amphibious assault exercises. That was going to be more fun than humping through the jungle. Before we began, we were introduced to our new company commander and his newly appointed XO. Charlie Company stood at attention when Captain Rekchek and Lieutenant Sutton appeared. Our company commander, Captain Rekchek, seemed really old. He had to be at least 29, and Lieutenant Sutton seemed almost as old, maybe 28. Rekchek looked squared away and was all business. There was no smiling, just assertive concern. Lieutenant Sutton followed him around because he knew Rekchek was in charge. Sutton, a tall, thin, dark-haired, physically fit individual, seemed a lot friendlier, with an occasional smile for the troops. Rekchek spoke in a loud and assertive voice. "Okay, Marines," he said. "I'm Captain Rekchek, and this is Lieutenant Sutton, my XO. A lot of you Marines who came from Khe Sanh will recognize Lieutenant Sutton, because he was the platoon commander of 3rd Platoon. I'm the new commanding officer of Charlie Company. I imagine you have a lot of questions about the extra training. Well, I'll fill you in on what's happened so far and what's about to happen. The Marines who came from Khe Sanh needed a facelift. While in Nam, every squad had depleted in numbers by almost half, and we were in need of new equipment. That is why you were brought here to Okinawa. You new men are here to boost the battalion to full strength, and, at the same time, train to use new tactics to defeat the enemy. This is why the 1st Battalion 3rd Marine Regiment came here to Okinawa to train and regroup. We have been chosen to be a fast reaction task force, a battalion of Marines that can be called on in a moment's notice. We are called SLF Alpha. Yes, get those initials clear. We have been selected to be SLF Alpha. What does SLF stand for, you may ask? We are a special landing force with a full reactionary battalion of 1,750 men and 68 officers. We will be different from any other Marine unit. Our rear area will be in Quang Tri, but the fighting force will be on a helicopter ship, the USS Okinawa. Our designation is a reactionary battalion. If any Marine unit catches shit, we can be called at a moment's notice to give them support. We will also be executing search and destroy operations. Today, we will be the first Marine unit to receive the new M16 rifles. The heavier M14 is no longer going to be our weapon of choice. The M16 is lighter, but it has the same stopping power of the M14. The new rifle is made of a resilient plastic with metal moving parts. It has a large spring inside the stock to absorb the recoil, making it more accurate and easier to shoot. You will be able to carry twice the ammunition because the rounds are half the size. We will be at the rifle range most of the day today and tomorrow, getting used to these new weapons. Wednesday and Thursday, we will train with Amtracs. Friday, we meet our helicopter squadron and practice takeoffs and landings. All next week, we will continue working the bugs out of our training. This will also help the Navy get their act together. The helicopter pilots, Amtrak personnel, as well as the ship's crews need this training as much as we do. Everything has to be coordinated to work perfectly, or men will die. Wednesday morning, we boarded trucks that took us to the harbor, where we then boarded LCMs, short for Landing Craft Mechanized. They are a much larger landing craft than the ones used in World War II. As we stood there waiting for the ramp to come down, it looked like the entire fleet was in the harbor. All sorts of ships were anchored: supply ships, destroyers, corvettes, and a helicopter ship looming in the distance. We were going to practice rope climbing on the USS Duluth, LPD, or Landing Platform Dock, like we had practiced on land with wooden structures. In order for Marines to speedily get on or off a ship, the Navy used cargo nets. The larger ship sends down nets, creating a rope ladder. The ladder could hold 3 Marines across, climbing up or down at the same time. The key to climbing a rope ladder is that you never put your hands on the horizontal part. Someone can always step on your hand, and down you go, with a sore hand, and maybe worse. The larger ship is usually steadier because of its size, where the LCM holds 100 men and moves rapidly up and down with the waves of the ocean. We had to hop on the rope ladder when the LCM was at the top of the wave. We were told that many Marines had been crushed between the 2 boats because they didn't time the jump just right. It didn't take us long to learn how to board, with only a couple of close calls. Once aboard, we were led into the depths of the Duluth. The LPD has a huge door that encompasses the entire back end of the ship and that is hinged to the bottom of the ship. The top part of the door lowers downward, creating a ramp that stops at wave level and leads to open water. Whatever is in the huge cavern can exit easily through the door. As we boarded the LPD, we were instructed to go through a bunch of passageways leading downward. There was a roaring sound coming at us from deep inside the ship that got louder as we moved closer to the ship's center. Our unit entered the cavern of the ship, where there were Amtraks lined up from front to back with all engines roaring. An Amtrak looks exactly like a small tank with tracks for wheels, but without the big gun turret on top. Attached to the front of the Amtrak is a watertight ramp that opens up the same way as the LPD, from top to bottom. The tracks of the Amtrak rotate in the water and create forward movement. When the front door opens, men and equipment can be loaded and offloaded. The 7-ton Amtrak is designed to float. That's the theory, anyway. My entire platoon walked down steel ladders attached to the side of the bulkhead wall. The sounds of the engines were deafening. Carbon monoxide and white clouds of gas filled the huge cavity of the ship. Once we arrived on the bottom floor, Staff Sergeant Malloy assigned 8 Marines to each Amtrak. We entered the steel tank, and with the sound of heavy hydraulics, the door closed and sealed behind us. I wondered if the damn thing could possibly float. It brought back memories of riding Shoot the Chutes at the Riverview Amusement Park. Standing in a crowded line at the age of 7 years, I was both excited and afraid for my life. The anticipation to get to the elevator was part of the excitement, but once we reached the top, my adrenaline really began to flow. I was so small I had difficulty entering the open-aired barge. It had several rows of long seats, and the seats accommodated up to 5 people across. Once we were fastened in by the safety crew, they released the gravity-fed boat, and it slid downward through a long chute. When it hit the pool at the bottom, it threw gallons of water on the riders. The thrill was mind-blowing. Boarding the Amtrak felt the same way as boarding the chutes. A loud horn sounded, blaring on and off. The Duluth's huge back door started its way down to the ramp position. As the door lowered in the down position and locked, another horn sounded, and the front Amtraks took off, full throttle, exiting the ship. One by one, the 7-ton vehicles went onto the ramp and then dove into the water nose first, and started sinking as if they were rocks. When our Amtrak went under the water, salt water poured in from various non-watertight places, and I felt a sense of doom. Next thing I knew, the roaring Amtrak started to float and move briskly forward toward the shore. It's incredible that damn thing floated with 8 men, full packs, and ammo. In no time at all, we rolled out of the water and onto a nearby beach. The front ramp opened, and the sun's rays almost blinded us. From there, we all climbed aboard trucks that were waiting to take us back to Camp Schwab. Pilgreen and I had been sitting next to each other during the entire Amtrak trip. He was a country boy and a realist. He always seemed to look at everything with a critical eye. I, on the other hand, just rolled along for the ride and didn't contemplate the meaning or the whys. Just follow orders, no matter what they are. Pilgreen said in his Alabama drawl, "Y'all suppose we're going to be riding a lot in the portable caskets?" "What?" I said as I laughed. "Did y'all think when we were under the water the Amtrak thingy would just keep going down to the bottom?" "Oh, hell yes," I said. "But it didn't." "Did y'all try and figure out why we're fighting this Vietnam War?" Pilgreen asked. "Sure," I said. "We're here to stop communism from spreading any further. Stopping it here, dead in its tracks." Pilgreen looked at me with a cocky smile on his face and said, "I know that's what they said. I was just wondering what you thought about it." He wanted me to think about it. He said it like he knew something I didn't. I blew it off, and we rode in the back of the open-air trucks to Camp Schwab, laughing and joking the whole way. I didn't realize it at the time, but Pilgreen had taken a liking to me and was taking me under his wing. One of the old salts was human after all. On April 3rd, we packed up our gear and headed for our new home, the USS Okinawa, LPH, short for Landing Platform Helicopter. She was a huge ship anchored in the middle of the harbor. The entire battalion was dropped off at the harbor ramp where an LCM landing craft was coming to pick us up. We had all our gear with us, packs filled with most of the items we would take out into the field, and a cartridge belt. We also brought our sea bags filled with our military clothes and personal belongings. A very large landing craft approached our position. The numbers 1582 were displayed in bold italic numbers on the driver's cabin. As the boat arrived, it slowly moved ashore. The ramp was already in the lowered position and began to grind against the shore as it pushed onto dry land. The sounds of small rocks and shells meeting the underside were like fingernails on a chalkboard. The LCM eventually stopped, and the entire platoon of 50 men boarded. The ramp went up, and the diesel engines roared with enough power to transport a tank. The boat had no problem backing out and turning around. As we cruised briskly toward the great helicopter ship, the USS Okinawa, the adrenaline rose inside me. The Okinawa was the largest ship I had ever seen. It was like approaching a skyscraper floating sideways on the water. 7 UH-34 choppers were secured at the very front of the ship and pointed in the direction the ship would be going. The chopper's blades had all been folded back to the rear of each chopper. I didn't know they could be altered like that. The LCM had 6 huge rimless truck tires hanging off its sides. When the LCM nudged up to the side of the Okinawa, the tires acted as cushions, preventing the two ships from damaging each other. Permanent steel ladders were attached to the side of the Okinawa to make it easier for personnel to get on and off the great ship. The bottom ladder, which was adjustable, was lowered into the LCM. The harbor was protected from the rolling waves of the ocean, and both ships connected very nicely. We all followed in a line, carrying our gear up the ladders and then into the innards of the ship. We ended up in the massive hangar deck, where 25 helicopters were stored. Continuing our trek, we walked all the way through the hangar deck to the other bulkhead, then through a door passage that led to ladders that went down into the depths of the ship. I felt like one of the third-class passengers of the RMS Titanic. We were guided through several passageways going deeper into the ship. In the passageways, huge pipes the same color as the hallways ran lengthwise along the ceiling. Everything was painted with a waterproof light gray semi-gloss paint. We entered a passageway that led us to our accommodations. It was a tight fit for 50 men to live and sleep. There were 2x2 footlockers for each of us where personal items could be stored. They were stacked 4 high throughout our quarters. The bunk beds were stacked 4 high, and only 22 inches separated them. Each bunk was made of a sturdy stretched canvas, and attached to the sides of the canvas were ropes holding the canvas to heavy-duty aluminum pipes. We were issued a small thin mattress, a pillow, and bedding. That was it. The passageways between bunks were very narrow, just large enough for two men to squeeze past each other. Of course, the grab-ass started immediately. The old salts bunked close to each other, and all the new guys did the same. The next thing was to get used to the ship and locate the bathrooms, showers, and chow hall. Every unit had its complainers. When we had to squeeze around them, Drust and Suminski made it known they were none too happy with the tight accommodations. It took us a couple of days to get accustomed to the ship. Word came down that we were going on a trial run attacking with choppers. We were going to assault Kinville, where we took our liberty, and Camp Hansen, another military base near Camp Schwab. So, on April 4th, the day before we were going to assault the two areas, we met in platoon groups on the hangar deck. With the extra training and leadership, we felt confident about the task ahead. Staff Sergeant Malloy and Lieutenant Francis led the discussion about what we were going to do in the morning. "Gentlemen, we will be taking off at 0800 tomorrow morning," Malloy said. "Our objective is to experience what it's going to be like to attack a village. 25 helicopters will be taking off from the deck of the Okinawa. Once we land, you will spread out and set up the perimeter so more choppers can come in. We'll expand the perimeter and then move on to the Ville in a sweep toward our objective, the barracks of Camp Hansen. We will then eat chow at Camp Hansen and afterward return to the original landing site where we'll board the choppers and head back to the ship. Then we'll do the same thing again tomorrow to work out the bugs." April 5th came, and we carried all our combat gear just as if we were in Vietnam. The gear we carried was heavy, but we were ready for anything the enemy could throw at us. The extra 40 to 50 pounds seemed necessary at the time. We all congregated in the hangar deck in our platoon groups of 45 to 50 men. We had 4 platoons in Charlie Company, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd infantry platoons, plus a weapons platoon. I casually met some of the men from the weapons platoon that had been attached to us. There was Don Bumgarner, we just called him Bum, a mortarman from Missouri. Burkett, in rockets, was from Southern Illinois. He carried the 3.5-inch rocket launcher commonly known as a bazooka. His assistant carried 6 high-explosive rounds. Bacon, the radio man for the XO, was from Ohio. 8 o'clock came fast that morning, and we had to make our way to the front of the hangar bay. The ship's PA system blared. "Now hear this. Battle stations, battle stations." We climbed up steel ladders attached to the side of the wall inside the ship's hangar deck. At the top of the ladder, there was a hallway that led to a door. As we got closer to the flight deck, we could hear the choppers warming up, and once through the door, we were on the flight deck. The sounds became magnified, and the wind hit my face. I could feel lightness in my stomach. You know that funny feeling that warns you of impending danger and excitement at the same time? Each Marine had to stay focused on the man in front of him at all times. We were sent out in groups of 5. One of the flight personnel ran with the first 5 men to the first chopper. There was another person standing at the door yelling for us to follow the white line. Still another guy yelled for us to keep our heads down when boarding. I approached the door to the flight deck and followed the Marine in front of me to the 3rd chopper from the back of the ship. Each group of 5 Marines ran in single file to the roaring helicopters. The choppers had practiced this maneuver before, but this time they were carrying combat-ready Marines. The ship was moving at about 30 miles an hour, and all the choppers were facing into the wind. I sat there on the floor of the chopper as the engines idled for what seemed to be at least 15 minutes. Then the sound of the chopper's engines became deafening. I felt alarmed as the chopper seemed to be out of control. It shook as if it would fall apart or explode. We could hear the choppers in front of us moving out. Ours started to lift off, and its tail moved to the side instead of forward. The lack of control lasted for only a couple of seconds. Once it was off the deck, the machine rose into the air. The nose tipped down, and the chopper moved forward. Just like that, we were moving away from the ship and following the choppers that had already taken off. Still more choppers followed behind us. It was to be our last training exercise. The real test was about to begin. Chapter 3. After we were mortared in the Quezon Valley and Lieutenant Sutton had been flown to the USS Sanctuary, Our first operation, Beaver Cage, was coming to an end. There were 3 more days of light contact, and then our battalion walked 20 miles to an extraction point where we were airlifted back to the USS Okinawa. We had lost only 1 Marine from my platoon, but several were wounded. In the whole battalion, 55 of our men were killed and 151 wounded. For us, it had been bad, but worse for the enemy. We were told that we'd killed more than 800 and captured 37. The NVA sacrificed hundreds dead and an equal or greater number wounded. They retreated to their hidden caves in the hills to lick their wounds because they couldn't continue in the onslaught they were receiving. I realized the NVA were unyielding to a point, then flexible enough to fall back when they became overwhelmed by our superior firepower. Marines would be able to regroup in their rear areas or, like our own battalion, use helicopters to return to the safety of the ship. It was going to be a long, hot walk to the extraction point, mostly through dried-out rice paddies and villages of the very old and the very young. I walked down a path that led to a hooch where an old woman and a little 5-year-old boy lived. The child looked poorer than any child I had ever seen in my life. All he wore was a pair of tattered shorts. His bare belly stuck out as if he were pregnant. I figured he had some kind of dysentery or worms. There was a huge scab on his forehead, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do for him. I approached the little boy and reached out toward his scalp and the scab. As soon as my hand got close to his head, about 40 flies scurried away. The scab I saw was not a scab at all, but rather flies eating away on his head. I was repulsed at the sight of it. I took the little boy by the hand and approached the old lady. From my pack I retrieved my only bar of soap and handed it to the mama-san, pointing to the little boy's head. She nodded, with no emotion at all. I wished I could do more to help the poor people of South Vietnam. I thought by destroying the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, we were supposed to be doing that. But something about the way that old mama-san accepted the soap gave me the impression that those old farmers didn't want us there any more than they wanted the NVA or VC. She didn't smile. She didn't show an ounce of gratitude. It was almost as if I'd forced her to take the soap at gunpoint, or that the offer was an insult. Either way, I felt that she didn't know why we were there any more than why the North was her enemy. They were just rural farmers who wanted nothing to do with the lot of us. They just wanted to be left alone. We continued through the Ville and then spread out as we exited into another rice paddy. Today my path headed toward a semi-dried pond that looked traversable. The top part of the ground was hard, but as I stepped, my foot sunk into a moist muck and I became bogged down. It seemed that the more I struggled, the farther my boot sunk into the quagmire. I was way beyond my calf in the muck. I tried to pull my right leg up, but it felt like I was sinking deeper and getting even more stuck. Pilgreen held out his hand and I grabbed it. We both struggled to lift my right leg, and to my surprise, it came right out. My boot came out all right, but the sole was gone. The jungle had eaten all the threads holding it to the shoe. I struggled to lift the other leg, and the same thing happened. Unlike everyone else, I had not been issued the jungle boots, and I had literally walked completely out of my boots in a single month. I unlaced my now completely worthless boots and took them off. I complained to Jones and Muller about the boots, and neither showed sympathy. "You'll just have to wait until the next chopper comes in tomorrow," Jones said. I was barefoot and was going to have to deal with it. After taking off what was left of my boots, I continued my trek. It was painful to step on prickly pieces of dried, hardened shrubs and sticks, dried-out grass shoots, and hot rocks. Next to the extreme thirst I had experienced in the days prior, this was the most physically painful day I had experienced in the war so far. For hours I walked, and every step seemed to get worse. The next morning, a supply chopper came with a brand new set of jungle boots. I had never realized how important good footwear was until I had none. Looking at my new boots, I wondered how the VC did it. They wore the Ho Chi Minhs, sandals made from used American tires. The local people went to our dumps and retrieved the thrown-out tires and tubes. They would take them back to their huts and cut the tire treads into soles. The inner tubes would serve as straps for holding the treads to their feet. I guess it's all what you get used to. Still, what a difference my shoes made for me. We walked until the end of the day. Some other units received sniper fire, and we were mortared, but now our company was moving out into a clearing where choppers began to arrive, taking us back to the USS Okinawa. We arrived back on the ship May 13th. The attitude of the men was not as somber as I had expected it to be. Everyone arrived as if we never left. The resilience of our company was apparent. Captain Rekchek had done a fantastic job, as had our forward observers and all the SLF Marines. We lost our executive officer when Lieutenant Sutton was wounded, but Rekchek was already looking for his replacement. We had gotten our first taste of battle, and I wondered what we had won. Did we take the ground we fought for? No, we didn't. Did we win the hearts and minds of the people? No, we didn't. What we did win was a numbers game. We killed, wounded, and captured more of them than they did us. I listened to the stories from everyone about our first encounter with Charlie. We had our trial by fire, and as we spoke together, I noticed the old salts began to show a closeness we hadn't seen before. They were just like us. One of the old salts talked about the day we thought the NVA were massing for an all-out assault and going to overrun us. "Remember that night when Puff showed up?" he recounted. "Earlier that day, Lieutenant Francis was going to send us on a suicide mission. So he goes up to Malloy and tells him this crazy plan where we attack the NVA down in the valley, right? But thank God, Malloy shakes his head and says, 'No way.' I mean, Malloy just totally and immediately rejects the idea." Lieutenant Francis, outraged at Malloy's disobedience, went to Captain Rekchek and suggested the plan to him, but Rekchek rejected his appeal as being too foolhardy. Then Rekchek says, "But I appreciate your willingness to think outside the box." The old salt laughed. I thought about the idea Francis had come up with. Now, knowing of all the traps that were set against other units, there was a good chance we would have been wiped out. Thank God for Sergeant Malloy and Captain Rekchek. I could only imagine what Sergeant Malloy was thinking about Francis going over his head. Platoon sergeants usually lead by experience, and the boot lieutenants listened to the older, more experienced sergeants. For the time being, however, Lieutenant Francis was gone. During the operation, he exposed himself to fire and was lightly wounded. I'm sure Malloy was relieved to know that Francis was gone and that he was now in total command. He didn't have to listen to Francis's crazy plans anymore. Still, Rekchek put Francis in for a Silver Star. For his leadership and courage during the operation, Captain Rekchek was awarded a Bronze Star. Chapter 4. Days passed, and there was still no letter from Kathy. It was really starting to bother me. Her letter was the first letter I looked for, and she was the first person I wrote to after boarding the ship. I asked if she was okay, and told her I loved and missed her. I began sending letters to everyone who knew her to find out why I didn't get any letters from her. One thing I did know, I was going to have to wait a while to get an answer. Our letters took a long time making it halfway around the world, and their replies took just as long to get back to us. A truly good thing about writing letters home is that we didn't have to pay for postage. We only had to write "postage free" in the top right corner of the envelope. It made it easier for us to write home. We had 4 days to clean ourselves up and recoup before the next operation, Operation Bowcharger. On May 17th, we were once again called to the hangar deck for a platoon meeting. Lieutenant Francis and Staff Sergeant Malloy were there. Lieutenant Francis had recovered enough from his wound to return for duty. Malloy said, "Marines, we are going in the DMZ tomorrow." The DMZ was the dividing line between North and South Vietnam. It ran from the hills of Khe Sanh in the west to the South China Sea in the east. I knew from the stories I had heard that the fighting in the DMZ was going to be different than fighting in the jungles and rice paddies. "The North Vietnamese Army has established positions south of the DMZ, and that puts them in South Vietnam," Malloy continued. "This is where we want them. We are not sure how many NVA we're up against because they have been secretly infiltrating the area for some time. There could be as many as what we were up against on Beaver Cage. It could be an entire division, perhaps 10,000 troops. Whatever their number is, we are going to destroy them. Before we do, we have to relocate about 10,000 civilians who live in this area. Unfortunately, this is exactly where the NVA have taken up their positions, using the civilians as bait. You are not allowed to fire at anyone until they fire at you first. I looked over to Pilgreen, and I could read his lips as he soundlessly mouthed, "Yeah, right." Malloy continued, "These civilians will have to be relocated for their own safety, and we don't need any civilian casualties. Once all civilians have been cleared, this will be a free-fire zone, and then you may kill anything that moves." "All right," someone said. Malloy didn't smile. He just continued, "Men, this has all the makings of one epic battle. Many battalions will be sweeping from the south, moving north toward the DMZ. We are expected to destroy the NVA in the area all the way to the DMZ. Our battalion will come in from the sea with a surprise flanking movement. The other battalions are on their respective operations. They are the 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 9th Marine Regiment, and the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 4th Marine Regiment. They are on Operation Hickory sweeping north right now." Wow, I thought to myself, that's 5,000 Marines. "All battalions will be sweeping north and northwest, moving toward the DMZ. 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines is on Operation Belt Tight and is also sweeping north at this moment." I was amazed at the manpower we were committing. Malloy continued, "The 5th Arvin Regiment is on Operation Lam Son 54, plus thousands of Vietnamese police have been called in to help with the transition of the civilians, escorting them south." I wondered how it was going to work, using the Vietnamese troops and police. We would have another 5,000, which equaled 10,000 troops on our side. Epic indeed, but I wasn't sure how much faith we could put into our South Vietnamese counterparts. There were rumblings among the Marines that they couldn't be trusted. Some were known to run at the first sign of battle. Others were thought to be traitors giving away our plans. Some were just scared to die and ineffective. "We take off at 1400 hours and land southeast of Con Thien at Landing Zone Goose. Once we land, we will set up our perimeter and establish our LZ. We will immediately move west to find and relocate the non-combatants out of the area." Someone yelled, "Dismissed!" Pilgreen came up to me and said, "Ever notice how the North Vietnamese keep coming into the South, but we can't go over the borders to get them? How about they get to try and kill you first before you can shoot them? They also get to place their artillery on the north side of the DMZ, but we can't go over there to knock it out. Kinda makes it hard to fight a war. What you think about that, Taylor? Kinda makes you wonder, doesn't it?" I looked at Pilgreen, thought about it, and frowned. Thoughts of Kathy and whether she was okay quickly pushed Pilgreen's question from my mind, though. I sure hoped she was okay. Morning came. Some of the old salts wanted to get a little extra sleep, but couldn't because of all the noise the guys were making. A few idle threats were tossed back and forth, but everyone settled in. Lunch was being served. Steiner, Mac, and I went early to get in line for what was to be our last meal on ship until we got back from Operation Bowcharger. We grabbed a silver tray in the mess hall and walked down the line. There were all types of lunch meats and breads, fried chicken, and slices of beef. Other foods displayed were an array of vegetables, mashed potatoes, and French fries. We found a place to sit. Next to us were 4 Navy guys, and their conversation caught our attention. One of the 4 said, "A lot of wounded Marines and body bags came in on the flight deck a little while ago. I guess they got hit pretty bad at LZ Goose. You know, they went out several hours ago. I was told that when they tried to land, they were hit by heavy machine gun fire, and one chopper even crashed, killed everyone aboard. Once the rest were on the ground, artillery and rockets rained down on them. I think up to 70 were either killed or wounded. 5 choppers came back so badly damaged they were taken out of service." "You know," Steiner said, "that could have been us." There was a moment of quiet apprehension as I pictured the scene. I imagined readying myself near the doorway as the chopper before us spun out of control. We sat down in a hot LZ with bullets punching through the fuselage. Marines sprint away from the open ground. some tumbling lifeless into the grass, others disappearing in the clouds of the explosions. I looked at Steiner and Mac, who were also lost in thought, and said nervously, "Do you think I might be able to get a note from my mother not to attend this field trip?" Steiner cracked a smile. "I already tried that, and Malloy flat out turned me down," he said. At 1 in the afternoon, we heard the PA system blast. "Now hear this. Battle stations. Battle stations." We headed up toward the hangar deck and prepared to go out to the choppers. That's where Staff Sergeant Malloy told us that our original landing site, Goose, was changed to LZ Owl, farther south. Steiner and I already knew why. What the Navy guy was saying in the chow hall was true. Choppers waited on the deck, and we started our march out to them. Pilgreen sat on the floor by the door. We had now done this enough that it was becoming routine. "Here we go again," I said. "4 more months and a hook, I'm out of here," Pilgreen replied. Pilgreen's 13th month was in the middle of September when he would get to go home to Alabama. I had 9 months left. It was pretty sketchy to think about how long I had to go. It felt like an eternity. "I worry about that last month," Pilgreen said. "You know, the extra month we as Marines have to spend in country." None of us knew why we had to serve the extra month, but we all felt that it was because we were Marines. All the other armed forces did 12-month tours. A lot of Marines got it in that last month of their tour, and this was Pilgreen's greatest fear. The choppers revved their engines, and we headed into the wind, gaining altitude increasingly fast. It didn't take long to see the Okinawa cruising off the coast of the DMZ. When we looked out the chopper door, we could see the bright white sand along the approaching coastline in the distance. It looked so beautiful, but we all knew it was deadly. There was a river to the north, and I thought it might be the Ben Hai, which divided the north from the south. I remembered what Pilgreen said about not being able to go after them on the north side. The area north of the Ben Hai River didn't look any different from the area south, at least from the air. The coast was now directly under our choppers, and we headed inland. We started our descent into what we all knew would be the abyss of the DMZ. There was a profound commonality in ideologies between the Marines and the North Vietnamese. It was to annihilate each other at all costs, to do whatever it takes to create havoc, chaos, and death against each other in this swath of land dividing the North from the South. We entered an area that was dense with trees, but with a space large enough to get 4 choppers in. We heard a bunch of sounds as if someone was throwing rocks at the chopper. It was the sound of bullets going right through the thin skin. The gunner manning the M60 machine gun sprayed an incessant fire into the tree lines below, focusing left, then right. There were a few NVA in the area, and they had opened up on us, hoping to kill a few Marines before we landed. I felt helpless listening to the sounds of bullets hitting the fuselage. The chopper set down, and we all exited briskly while blasting the tree line in front of us. The firing stopped. Whoever was shooting at us had apparently decided to relocate to another area or to hide in spider holes. The ground was half sand and half dirt. There was a layer of grass on top of the soil with bare spots of bright white sand. Mortars had hit there previously, creating blast marks everywhere. 3-foot weeds were clumped together all over the landing zone. Trees and brush surrounded us everywhere we looked. I heard sniper fire in the distance. We moved into positions to protect the landing zone. Our men were heavily laden with packs on their backs, flak jackets, and M16 rifles. Machine gun crews had just landed with the heavier M60 machine guns and boxes of ammo. We were ready for a fight. Captain Rekchek got the Marines moving in a northeasterly direction. Our platoon was given the job of covering the right flank of the company. Snipers picked at us along the way. Normally, we would maneuver to annihilate the threat, but we had to remain focused on accomplishing our mission of relocating indigenous people out of the area. Besides, they could have been trying to draw us into an ambush, so going after them would not necessarily be a good idea. Meanwhile, the NVA were sending thousands of troops and several spearheads to overwhelm the Marines south of the DMZ. As we continued to move north toward our original landing area, LZ Goose, I noticed our company had picked up about 25 old men, women, and small children. It pained me to see these old people bent over and sadly struggling along within our unit. They didn't carry much of anything. I thought of the refugees fleeing from the German war machine in World War II. Those refugees had hauled all their belongings in large carts pulled by horses. These evacuees were carrying bags of rice and a few other household items they needed for survival, and little more on their backs. Old Mama-sans and Papa-sans wore black pajamas. There wasn't a single person between the ages of 8 and 60 years old. I wondered if the missing age group was a part of the South or North Vietnamese Army. Were the people with our platoon just old people wanting to survive, or communist sympathizers acting as lookouts for the elusive enemy? As we moved through the hostile area, we went in a westerly direction, picking up an additional 15 people. By 6:30 p.m., our platoon had about 40 to 50 civilians. The company had an additional 225 indigents. Tanks and Amtraks picked up the people and their belongings. Marines loaded them aboard anything that had tracks. A couple of hours passed, and it was getting dark. Our movement slowed because we had to wait for the Amtraks to return for more civilians. We definitely overstayed our visit, because as soon as the Amtraks arrived, we started getting hit with mortar fire. The rounds went over our heads, but everyone still dove for cover. There was a tree line in the distance where we figured the Gooks had set up their mortars. That's where the rounds were originating. Tanks and Amtraks moved forward to take up positions to attack the tree line and secure the area. As the armored vehicles moved forward, an RPG rocket was launched and streaked toward one of the Amtraks. We heard a boom, and the Amtrak exploded, killing everyone inside. I averted my eyes to avoid the carnage. The Amtrak had been filled with civilians, women and children. You could tell from the blast that no one could have survived. The tanks immediately pulled back as 15 more RPGs were fired. Smoke trails followed the rockets toward the tracked vehicles. Fortunately for us, the rockets missed their intended targets. Jets came in overhead, and the mortars ceased firing from the tree line. As the jets banked toward the tree line, the last of the civilians were hurried into the last Amtrak. The jets were F-4 Phantoms. They started diving in from west to east, and they had the tree line zeroed in. The F-4s dropped their 500-pound bombs directly on the tree line. Huge explosions erupted, and we could see trees, dirt, and debris flying everywhere. The sleek, silver-colored, fast-moving aircraft followed each other up again for another run. They came in a second time on the same 45-degree angle. They let their cargoes of explosives fall again on the tree line. The ground shook. I felt like I was at the scene of a train accident as I watched in horror and thankful exhilaration. It was like watching live TV, but we couldn't turn the channel. I was grateful that we didn't have to experience that kind of firepower. The incursion of the jets had stopped the firing from the tree line for now. We dug in for the night. It was really hard to dig our fighting holes. The soil was mostly sand with just enough dirt to give it a little strength, barely holding it together. Our foxholes kept collapsing. I'm sure the NVA had the same problem. As dusk fell, a mortar barrage of about 40 rounds crashed directly on our lines. All night long we got hit, and then there would be a lull in the action. We would then send our artillery on their positions. They, in turn, sent mortars and artillery back on our positions. Just trying to stay alive was a full-time job. Throughout the night, desperate cries rang out, "Corpsmen up!" The next day, we began sweeping the same area we swept previously. As we started to move, sniper fire erupted from our front. We held up, and then the mortars started again. They exploded randomly all around us. The NVA seemed to know exactly where we were. They were ready to deliver whatever they had on our positions at a moment's notice. F-4 Phantoms arrived again and blasted the suspected positions. When the jets arrived and dumped more 500-pound bombs, the mortars stopped firing at us and we were able to move out. The jet incursions kept the NVA off balance and kept their heads down. After we moved out, mortar rounds hit exactly where we had previously sat. We kept moving for several days, picking up more of the local population. They were evicted from their homes, which made the area a free fire zone. From then on, Anybody remaining in the area, whether they were truly combatant or not, could be killed. On the 20th, we picked up another 135 rural farmers, and on the 21st, another 84. Then, on May 23rd, we observed a 24-hour truce in honor of Buddha's birthday, with no incidents reported by anyone. By now, I was extremely dirty. My utilities were loaded with a grease-like grime. Dirt and sand covered all the green from my waist down. Days of digging foxholes that kept collapsing, plus kneeling and crawling in filth, caused us to be filthy. There were no bathrooms in the DMZ. Trying to find a place to dispose of our digestive wastes was nearly impossible. No one wanted to be around when we dug our hole and squatted. The fact was that once a day we each had to go and make that disgusting run. That alone would make us vulnerable to a sniper's bullet. Then, on top of that, not taking a bath for days was as dirty as one could get. After the third day, it didn't make any difference. We were dirty, and we were going to stay that way for quite a while. We kept moving, sweeping back and forth over the same area in the DMZ, and getting hit as we set in for the night. Mortar rounds blew up all around us constantly. After getting hit over and over, Captain Rekchek realized that we were getting hit every time we set up for the night. One evening, we set in and dug our foxholes exactly the way we had the previous night. Just before dusk, Rekchek made the company saddle up and abandon the holes we dug. We moved about 50 yards south from the original site. You should have heard the grunts complaining. The Marines in the hole next to me bitched like crazy. "What a bunch of crap," someone said. "Why can't they just make up their frickin' minds?" the other whined. As darkness set in, the rounds came in as expected, but they exploded in the area that we had just evacuated. Rekchek had figured out how to trick the NVA into thinking we were somewhere we weren't. We recognized that Rekchek was flexible, getting smarter every day, and that he truly cared about his men. On the 6th day, we received intense machine gun fire and mortars from another distant tree line to our north. Our forward observer began talking to the F-4 fighter pilots. He was able to zero in to the pilot the exact place where the firing was emanating. This time, the jets came in from the sea. They came in screaming low and fast behind us. They darted in a westerly direction, lowering their altitude as an ear-shattering roar rushed over us. A feeling of power went through me. The jets banked hard right and set up for their run on the tree line. The two F-4s headed directly for the tree line side by side. It was like watching a football game where the home team player was running to the end zone for a touchdown. We were screaming for him to score. "Kick their asses! Blow the bastards to hell!" The jets were lower than usual and about 50 yards above the trees. It didn't look like they were being fired on, but I'm sure they were. As they approached the tree line, we could see silver canisters being released, 2 from each wing. The canisters rolled end over end directly toward the tree line. I thought to myself, "Oh my God, they're dropping napalm." 8 explosions happened simultaneously. The jets had dumped their entire load. Bright red flames erupted along the entire length of the tree line. Then a huge round ball of a ferocious, billowing red and black volcanic-type eruption made its way above the trees. The flames settled down a little as the round, black clouds continued upward. Everyone's eyes were wide at the onslaught that happened in front of us. We were extremely happy because the jets sure calmed things down again. We didn't get any more fire from the NVA. We swept for several days until the 26th. All that happened was harassing sniper fire. Our mission was now complete. All Marine units on the operation had lost a total of 142 men, with 896 more wounded. Out of that total, our battalion lost 23 Marines and had 99 wounded. On the 26th, all the 1st Battalion 3rd Marines headed toward the ocean where landing craft were sent to pick us up and take us back to the USS Okinawa before our next mission. At least we would have mail call, and I could see if there were any letters from Kathy. By now, there had to be a letter waiting for me. Chapter 5. After being on the ship for 3 days, there was talk of a new mission brewing, and sure enough, Jones came down into the squad bay.
"Listen up, everyone," he said. "Tomorrow is June 2nd. We are going on another mission, this time to Death Valley. The name of the operation is Bear Bite. There will be a platoon meeting at 1500 hours on the hangar deck tomorrow."
The next day on the hangar deck, Jones and Francis began to describe what we were to expect. Staff Sergeant Malloy came forward, interjecting our plan of attack before Lieutenant Francis could say a word.
"Men, we are headed to the Tua Tien area, which is in the Quang Tri province," he said. "This area is known as Death Valley. Death Valley is a fertile valley that is located between three mountain ranges. It's a hornet's nest of Viet Cong."
I instantly hated the name Death Valley.
"The VC will be setting up booby traps everywhere," Malloy continued, "especially in tree lines where they expect us to pass. You never know which tree line they will lace. We are expecting mainly butterfly mines and bouncing betties. If any of these devices go off, take cover immediately. Charlie is known for taking advantage of our delays. They also love to slow us up so they can prepare ambushes and preset mortar barrages."
We were taught in booby trap school that the most horrendous booby trap of all is the Bouncing Betty mine. The reason for this is because it is the hardest mine to detect. The mine is totally buried in the ground with the exception of 3 little prongs. Once one of the prongs is activated, it would release a mortar projectile 3 to 8 feet into the air and explode, sending hot shards of steel in every direction. The individual who sets it off usually dies. Everyone within 15 feet around him becomes wounded with shrapnel. If it explodes at 3 feet, it blows off your legs. A little higher, and it blows your stomach apart. Higher, and you can imagine what happens. I dreaded the thought of setting out in the morning. Nighttime came fast on the ship, and it was time to go to sleep. All the lights went out except the dimly lit exit lights. A lot of Marines settled in the ship's cafeteria to write letters home to a wife, sweetheart, parents, or friends. I sat in the chow hall drinking hot coffee into the night. As I looked around the cafeteria, some of the guys talked while others played card games, especially poker. I didn't get involved with the poker games because the same guys kept winning. I thought they were very skilled, the luckiest people alive, or were just flat out cheating. My lousy pay of $100 a month plus $65 combat pay didn't go very far, and I wasn't going to take a chance at losing it. In 6 hours, reveille would sound. The cooks made loaves of bread for the following day's meals. The smell alone made my mouth water. If we were up late enough, we could sneak into the galley where the racks of fresh homemade bread were kept. This evening, as Steiner and I left the cafeteria, we quietly entered the confines of the kitchen and stole 2 loaves of that magnificent bread. We were like mice stealing the cheese and hiding away, eating it in a hidden cavity of the ship. I put my nose to the loaf, closed my eyes, and took in the smell. I said, just like Grandma used to make. By 4:59 a.m., the squad bay was silent. All the men were sleeping in their bunks, stacked 4 high, one on top of another. The lights came on at 5. I heard someone snoring a few bunks away. At 5:45, most were in the squad bay finishing up last-minute details before moving out to our place of departure. The word came down from Sergeant Jones that we were moving out of the squad bay in 10 minutes. As we left the squad bay, Marines passed out ammo and grenades. A loud sound came out of the speaker system. "Now hear this. Battle stations. Battle stations." I was feeling pretty good until I heard the sound of the PA, but the announcement triggered a Pavlovian response and filled me immediately with fear. Looking around the hangar bay, I wondered what the Navy guys were thinking about us. I suspected they were probably glad they hadn't joined the Marines. We headed for the stairs that took us to the flight deck and waited for our turn to advance to the choppers, getting ready to depart to the skies. The first set of choppers had already taken off. My platoon was going to be in the second wave, and we waited for the choppers' return. The choppers began landing on the Okinawa, and we anxiously prepared for our turn. Jones was there at the top of the stairs, along with some Navy flight deck personnel, as we started moving up. As soon as we were in position, we were sent out, 5 at a time. The first group of 5 would be designated to the closest chopper. The next 5 would move out to the next chopper, and so on. This continued until all choppers were full. The order was given to lift off. As I sat there in the waiting chopper, my mind seemed to be on hold, with no thoughts at all. I found myself just staring blankly at Wakefield, one of the old salts from Khe Sanh, and waiting for the first choppers to accelerate their engines. The gunner with his special green flight suit and helmet looked over at me and smiled. I smiled back and gave him a thumbs up. He gave me a thumbs up in return. We still hadn't taken off, and I looked beyond the gunner and outside the chopper door. The ship was about 10 miles from the shoreline and running parallel to it. A brisk wind hit the flight deck, and I wondered if it would affect our takeoff. The engine roared, and then the chopper started moving awkwardly at first. The scent of exhaust fumes filled the cargo bay. A gust of wind caught the spinning rear blades, causing the tail to slide a little to the left. The pilot corrected the misalignment immediately. We moved upward and proceeded forward. All choppers were in the air, and the USS Okinawa started looking smaller as we pulled away. I saw the huge elevator platform that moved the choppers from the hangar deck to the flight deck. The elevator platform was located in the middle of the ship and on the port side. The elevator had a large, cavernous opening where the crews maneuvered the choppers in and out of the hangar deck. Men were moving all over the flight deck. They began to look like ants on a plastic model I might have put together as a young boy. Little by little, the ship disappeared. In the distance on the horizon was a speck of white. This was our shadow, the hospital ship, USS Repose. Our chopper kept climbing. Soon we were high over the coast of Vietnam. The gooks must have been able to see us and know that we were coming. Below, I saw hooches and little square green and brown patches of farmland. We started our descent, and the loud roar of the engines began to fade. The sudden descent plugged my ears, so I yawned and felt a rush of noise fill my head. Steiner pointed his finger down, but when I leaned over and looked out the door, I couldn't see what he was pointing at. I saw the hooches and fields much more clearly the closer we got. Still, there were no signs of life. The Vietnamese I was looking for would look small from this altitude, but I should be able to see the local farmers. My curiosity overwhelmed me. I needed to see more from the window behind me, so I got up from my sitting position to a crouch and looked out. The ground was closing in, and the engines kicked in to slow the chopper's descent. Marines maneuvered to get on their feet just before we touched the ground. The choppers made a swift landing, and we all departed out the door.